Some cars are fast, some are beautiful, and some, they're straight-up death traps. They look good, sound good, maybe even drive like a dream. But behind the wheel, they've taken more lives than most people realize. We're talking about cars with sketchy handling, deadly designs, and speeds that outpace their safety. And one of the worst offenders? It was sold as a family car. So buckle up. Here are 12 deadly cars that earned their reputation the hard way. Let's start with a classic that still haunts gearheads, the Porsche 911. Now guys, before you start freaking out in the comments, I'm referring specifically to the classic air-cooled models, timeless design, iconic performance, and a rear engine layout that was borderline evil in the wrong hands. You see, old 911s had all the weight sitting over the back wheels. That meant Slayer traction, until it didn't. In a high-speed turn, if you lifted off the throttle or braked too suddenly, that back end would whip around and throw you into a spin, or worse. The phenomenon became known as lift-off oversteer, and it caught countless drivers off guard. Even professional racers struggled with it. The car would grip beautifully through a corner, giving you confidence to push harder, then suddenly snap sideways without warning. The problem was physics. With 60% of the car's weight behind the rear axle, the 911 was essentially a pendulum on wheels. Under hard acceleration, that weight distribution provided incredible traction, launching the car forward with authority. But the moment you backed off the throttle in a corner, that heavy rear end wanted to swing around and overtake the front. It defied driver intuition. Most cars understeer when you lift off the gas, meaning they push wide. The 911 did the opposite, snapping into violent oversteer that could send you spinning into oncoming traffic or off a cliff. Racing legend and Porsche test driver Vic Elford once said the early 911 was like riding a tiger. You could control it if you knew what you were doing, but one mistake and it would turn on you instantly. The car demanded a completely different driving technique. You had to stay on the throttle through corners, using the engine to control the car's balance. Lift off suddenly, and you'd better be ready for a wild ride. The statistics were sobering. Insurance companies classified the 911 as one of the most dangerous sports cars on the road. Emergency rooms saw a steady stream of 911 drivers who'd learned the hard way about lift-off oversteer. Yet enthusiasts kept buying them, convinced they could master the beast. Many discovered that confidence and physics don't always align. Even skilled drivers lost control, and yet people kept buying them, thinking they could handle it. Let's just say, many found out the hard way. But there were cars so fast and so dangerous that this wasn't just a matter of opinion or lack of skill. They literally got banned, such as this one, the Chevrolet Corvair. Ralph Nader called it unsafe at any speed, and he wasn't joking. GM's budget-friendly rear-engine car had one tiny problem: the swing axle suspension. It was unstable during turns, and combined with the rear-heavy design, it would cause the rear tires to tuck under during cornering. The result? Sudden oversteer, rollovers, crashes, and fatalities. The Corvair's problems went deeper than just suspension geometry. GM engineers knew about the handling issues during development, but chose to prioritize cost savings over safety. The swing axle design was cheaper to manufacture than a more sophisticated independent rear suspension, but it created a nightmare scenario for average drivers. When cornering hard, the outside rear wheel would tuck under the car, dramatically reducing tire contact with the road. This jacking effect would lift the entire rear of the car, making it prone to sudden violent rollovers. What made this particularly deadly was that the Corvair was marketed as an affordable family car. Soccer moms and commuter dads bought these thinking they were getting a practical, economical vehicle. They weren't trained race car drivers who might recognize the warning signs of impending disaster. When the car suddenly lurched sideways in an emergency maneuver, most drivers had no idea how to react. The tire pressure issue made everything worse. GM specified different pressures for front and rear tires, with the rear requiring significantly higher pressure. But this critical information wasn't clearly communicated to owners. Many drove with improperly inflated tires, exacerbating the handling problems. A Corvair with incorrect tire pressure wasn't just unstable, it was a rolling death trap waiting for the right circumstances to strike. Internal GM documents later revealed that company executives received warnings about the Corvair's dangers as early as 1960. Engineers conducted tests showing the car's propensity to roll over, but management decided the cost of redesigning the suspension wasn't justified. They gambled with customer safety, and customers paid the price with their lives. The car's problems weren't limited to handling either. Early models had heating systems that could leak deadly carbon monoxide into the passenger compartment. Some owners were found unconscious or dead in their cars, poisoned by exhaust fumes. The heating system drew air from around the engine bay, where small exhaust leaks could contaminate the cabin with toxic gases. It got so bad that it sparked lawsuits, investigations, and a national debate about auto safety. The Corvair wasn't just deadly, it helped launch America's entire consumer protection movement. But it's not just vintage metal. The Ford Explorer was another car that claimed far too many lives, specifically the 1990s models. Looks like a safe family SUV, right? But pair it with Firestone tires and you've got a rolling death machine. Here's what happened. Those Explorers came with factory Firestone tires that were prone to tread separation. At highway speeds, that meant a sudden blowout. Combine that with the Explorer's high center of gravity, and you have massive rollover risks. The Ford Explorer Firestone tire crisis wasn't just about defective tires. It was about two companies pointing fingers while people died. The Firestone ATX, ATX2, and Wilderness AT tires came standard on millions of Explorers. These tires had a fatal flaw in their construction. The steel belts that reinforced the tread would separate from the tire carcass, especially in hot weather. When this happened at highway speeds, the tire would literally disintegrate, sending chunks of rubber flying and causing immediate loss of control. Ford knew the Explorer had stability issues even before the tire problems surfaced. Internal company emails revealed concerns about the SUV's tendency to roll over during emergency maneuvers. The vehicle's track width was relatively narrow compared to its height, creating an unstable platform. Engineers had recommended widening the stance or lowering the center of gravity, but marketing departments worried these changes would hurt the Explorer's rugged image. The temperature factor made everything worse. In hot climates like Arizona, Texas, and Florida, the tire failures skyrocketed. The combination of high ambient temperatures, hot asphalt, and high-speed driving caused the tire adhesives to break down. Families planning vacation road trips were unknowingly driving time bombs. Many blowouts occurred on straight highways, where drivers had no warning and no time to react safely. What made the situation particularly tragic was that many victims were families with children. The Explorer was marketed as the perfect family hauler, safe and reliable for soccer practice runs and camping trips. Parents trusted these vehicles with their most precious cargo, only to have that trust betrayed by corporate cost-cutting and engineering compromises. The cover-up attempts made the scandal even worse. Both Ford and Firestone had received hundreds of complaints about tire failures and rollover crashes years before taking action. They blamed driver error, improper maintenance, and even sabotage before finally acknowledging the systemic problems. Congressional hearings revealed a pattern of suppressed information and delayed recalls that cost lives. Over 200 deaths were linked to this combo. It triggered one of the biggest automotive recalls in U.S. history, a family SUV that became a national scandal. Now, if you thought that was bad, wait till you hear what this muscle car was doing. The Ford Mustang II. Released during the 1970s oil crisis, this car was a Mustang in name only. Ford needed something lighter, smaller, more fuel efficient. But what they built was dangerously under-engineered. It had weak crash protection, sloppy suspension, and poor high-speed handling. But the real slayer? They offered it with a V8 engine, without upgrading the brakes or chassis. The Mustang II represented everything wrong with 70s automotive thinking. Ford took a platform designed for economy cars, the Pinto chassis, and tried to transform it into a performance machine. It was like putting a rocket engine on a bicycle, theoretically possible but practically insane. The chassis simply wasn't designed to handle the stresses that serious power would create. The V8 option, available from 1975 onward, created a fundamentally unbalanced vehicle. Ford stuffed a 302 cubic inch engine, the same basic power plant used in full-size cars, into a lightweight unibody designed for four-cylinder economy. The front suspension geometry couldn't properly control the additional weight, leading to severe nosedive under braking and dangerous handling characteristics in emergency situations. Braking was the most critical failure. The same brake system used on the four-cylinder economy version was expected to stop a car with significantly more power and weight. Under hard braking, especially from high speeds, the Mustang II would experience severe brake fade. The drums would overheat, causing a dramatic reduction in stopping power just when you needed it most. Many accidents involved drivers who couldn't stop in time because their brakes had simply given up. The steering system was equally compromised. The manual steering box, adequate for parking lot maneuvers, became dangerously heavy at highway speeds. Power steering helped, but the system was borrowed from larger Ford vehicles and wasn't properly calibrated for the Mustang II's lighter weight. This created an artificial, disconnected feel that made it difficult to sense what the wheels were doing. Drivers couldn't feel the early warning signs of loss of traction. Structural integrity was another major concern. Crash tests revealed that the Mustang II's passenger compartment would collapse in moderate speed impacts. The door frames would buckle, trapping occupants inside burning wreckage. The fuel tank placement, inherited from the Pinto, created additional fire risks in rear-end collisions. Ford had learned nothing from the Pinto's deadly reputation. The suspension tuning prioritized comfort over control, with soft springs and weak shock absorbers. In spirited driving, the car would pitch and roll dramatically, making it nearly impossible to maintain control through a series of corners. The rear axle would hop and skip under acceleration, causing sudden changes in direction that could send the car into oncoming traffic. So you had all this power and none of the control. Sounds like a recipe for disaster? It was. Drivers pushed it, lost control, and paid the price. Now, we've got to talk about a car that actually exploded on impact. And it was once again a Ford creation. But before I reveal this car to you, make sure you race to the subscribe button, as 99% of you aren't subscribed. Now, what did Ford do that was so bad to the point that it exploded on impact? The Ford Pinto. You've probably heard the horror stories. A compact car that was cheap, practical, and deadly in rear-end collisions. Why? Because the fuel tank was mounted just inches from the back bumper, with almost no protection. Get hit from behind? The tank could rupture and burst into flames. The Ford Pinto case became a textbook example of corporate evil, studied in business schools and ethics courses worldwide. The car's fuel system wasn't just poorly designed, it was criminally negligent. The fuel tank sat directly behind the rear axle. In rear-end impacts above 25 miles per hour, the tank would be pushed forward into sharp bolts and brackets, puncturing the metal and spilling gasoline throughout the passenger compartment. But the mechanical failure was only half the story. The real scandal was Ford's internal cost-benefit analysis, a document that would forever change how Americans viewed corporate responsibility. Company accountants calculated that fixing the fuel tank design would cost $11 per vehicle, or about $137 million across the entire production run. They then estimated the cost of potential lawsuits from burn deaths and injuries, factoring in an estimated 180 burn deaths and 180 serious burn injuries. Using government figures that valued a human life at $200,000, they concluded it would be cheaper to pay settlements than fix the cars. The Pinto fires weren't quick, merciful deaths. Victims often survived the initial impact but couldn't escape as flames engulfed the passenger compartment. The doors would jam from impact damage, and the windows were difficult to break from inside. Rescue workers described horrific scenes of people trapped in burning cars, fully conscious and screaming for help that couldn't arrive in time. Some victims suffered burns over 90% of their bodies, but survived long enough to describe their agony to investigators. The cover-up was systematic and thorough. Ford destroyed internal crash test films that showed Pinto fuel tanks rupturing in relatively minor impacts. They suppressed engineering reports, recommending design changes, and transferred whistleblower employees to remote positions where they couldn't influence policy. When lawsuits began mounting, Ford's legal team worked aggressively to seal court records and prevent damaging information from reaching the public. Even more disturbing were the missed opportunities to fix the problem. After production began, Ford engineers developed several inexpensive solutions that would have dramatically improved fuel system integrity. A simple plastic barrier could have prevented tank puncture for less than $5 per car. Relocating the tank above the rear axle would have cost about $15. But production was already underway, and management feared that acknowledging the need for changes would constitute an admission of liability. The international comparison made Ford's negligence even more obvious. European safety standards required better fuel system protection, and Ford actually built safer Pintos for export markets. American customers were essentially getting a deliberately cheapened, more dangerous version of the same car. Ford knew how to build safer vehicles. They just didn't think American lives were worth the extra cost. Even worse, internal memos later showed Ford knew about the issue and decided it would be cheaper to pay lawsuit settlements than fix the design. That alone should make your skin crawl. It wasn't just a deadly car, it was deadly by design. Let's take a short detour to Italy and talk about the Lamborghini Murciélago. Insanely powerful, stunning to look at, but early models? Deadly in the hands of the wrong driver. With over 570 horsepower and brutal acceleration, it demanded expert control. And yet it came with poor visibility, minimal driver assists, and heavy steering. Owners crashed them a lot. And because of its speed and low seating position, when it hit something, it hit hard. The Murciélago represented Lamborghini's philosophy, taken to deadly extremes. This was a car built for experienced drivers who understood the consequences of 570 horsepower delivered through an uncompromising all-wheel drive system. But many buyers were wealthy enthusiasts who had more money than driving skill, a combination that proved fatal time and again. Visibility was perhaps the car's greatest weakness. The A-pillars were massive, creating huge blind spots that could hide entire vehicles. The rear window was tiny and positioned so low that backing up required faith more than sight. Parking became a terrifying experience, with many owners relying entirely on expensive proximity sensors that often failed. On the road, changing lanes was like playing Russian roulette. You never knew what might be hiding in those vast blind zones. The power delivery was savagely immediate. Unlike modern supercars with sophisticated traction management, early Murciélagos would unleash their full fury with little electronic intervention. The V12 engine produced massive torque across a wide rev range, and the all-wheel drive system could overwhelm even experienced drivers. In wet conditions, the car became nearly uncontrollable, with power sliding becoming power flying off the road. Insurance companies quickly learned to fear the Murciélago. The combination of massive power, poor visibility, and inexperienced owners created a perfect storm of expensive claims. Many insurance companies simply refused to cover them, while others charged premiums that exceeded the cost of more sensible supercars. The few companies that would insure them often required extensive driver training and track experience. The car's construction made crashes particularly devastating. The low seating position meant that in any significant impact, occupants were sitting at the level of other vehicles' bumpers and door frames. The carbon fiber body panels, while lightweight, didn't absorb impact energy like traditional steel construction. Instead, they would shatter on impact, providing minimal protection for occupants. Emergency responders dreaded Murciélago accidents. The car's exotic construction meant that traditional rescue equipment often proved useless. The jaws of life couldn't cut through carbon fiber and aluminum space frames effectively, and the fuel system's complexity made fire suppression challenging. Many fire departments had to develop specialized protocols just for handling supercar crashes. The psychological factor couldn't be ignored either. The Murciélago made drivers feel invincible, with its dramatic styling and incredible performance creating a false sense of control. Many owners pushed these cars beyond their abilities on public roads, treating highways like racetracks. The car's theatrical presence, dramatic scissor doors, and aggressive styling seemed to encourage showing off, often with tragic results. Many of the fatal crashes involved high-speed collisions, often with younger or inexperienced drivers behind the wheel. But the next car might actually be worse. The TVR Cerbera. This British beast had no airbags, no ABS, no traction control, and could do 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. TVR didn't believe in nanny tech. They thought the driver should be in total control, which sounds cool, until you realize the Cerbera could slay you for the smallest mistake. Wet roads, too much throttle, a missed braking point, that's all it took. TVR's philosophy was pure and terrifying. Build the fastest, most engaging cars possible, and let natural selection sort out who was worthy of driving them. The Cerbera embodied this thinking completely. It was essentially a barely tamed race car with license plates, built by people who believed that safety equipment was for cowards and inferior drivers. The Cerbera's power-to-weight ratio was absolutely insane for a road car. With over 400 horsepower in some configurations and weighing less than 500 pounds, it had better acceleration than most contemporary supercars. But unlike Ferraris or Porsches, which came with sophisticated chassis tuning and electronic aids, the Cerbera was raw and unfiltered. The throttle response was immediate and savage, the rear wheels eager to break traction at the slightest provocation. Hand-built construction meant that quality control was essentially non-existent. Each Cerbera was slightly different from the last, and not in a good way. Engines might produce significantly different power outputs. Suspension components might be assembled incorrectly, and electrical systems were notoriously unreliable. Some cars left the factory with potentially dangerous defects that wouldn't be discovered until they failed catastrophically on the road. The steering was perhaps the most challenging aspect. TVR used an extremely quick steering ratio that made the car incredibly responsive, but also dangerously twitchy. At highway speeds, a small movement of the steering wheel could cause dramatic changes in direction. Many accidents involved drivers who simply couldn't react quickly enough to the car's sudden movements. The steering was also unassisted, requiring significant physical strength to control at low speeds, but becoming dangerously light and nervous at high speeds. Braking was another nightmare. Without ABS, the Cerbera required perfect brake modulation to avoid wheel lockup. Most drivers, accustomed to modern anti-lock systems, would hit the brakes hard in an emergency and immediately lose steering control as the front wheels locked up. The car would continue straight ahead, unsteerable. until it hit whatever was in its path. The interior was deliberately Spartan, with minimal padding or protection for occupants. TVR believed that comfortable interiors made drivers complacent, so they built cabins that kept you constantly aware of your mortality. There were sharp metal edges everywhere, and the roll cage, while theoretically protective, created additional injury hazards in minor accidents. Weather made everything worse. The Cerbera on wet roads was essentially undrivable for all but the most skilled drivers. Without traction control or stability management, any application of power would send the rear end sliding sideways. Many owners simply parked their cars when rain was forecast, knowing that attempting to drive in wet conditions was essentially suicidal. And since the car was hand-built, quality control was spotty at best. Some of these cars were practically booby-trapped from the factory. Now let's rewind a bit to one of the most ironic deaths in car history. The Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing. Yes, it's beautiful. Yes, it's a legend. But early models had a dark secret. Those gorgeous Gullwing doors, once they were shut, you were trapped. If the car rolled over or caught fire, there was no quick escape. And yes, that happened. Several drivers were burned alive or crushed because rescue teams couldn't get the doors open in time. The 300 SL Gullwing's doors weren't just a styling statement. They were an engineering necessity born from the car's race-bred space frame chassis. The frame rails were so high that conventional doors would have been impossible, so Mercedes designed the unique upward-opening Gullwing system. But what looked revolutionary on the racetrack became a death trap on public roads. The door mechanism was incredibly complex, with multiple hinges, springs, and adjustment points that could fail without warning. Unlike modern Gullwing systems with backup releases and emergency mechanisms, the 300 SL doors had only one way to open. If the mechanism jammed, whether from accident damage or mechanical failure, occupants were completely trapped. The windows were small and positioned too high to serve as viable escape routes. Fire was the most terrifying scenario. The 300 SL's fuel injection system was revolutionary for its time, but prone to leaks and failures. A mechanical fuel injection pump pressurized gasoline throughout the engine bay, and any rupture in the system could spray fuel onto hot engine components. Once a fire started, it spread quickly through the magnesium alloy body panels, which burned with intense heat that was nearly impossible to extinguish. Emergency responders in the 1950s had no experience with Gullwing door mechanisms. Standard rescue procedures assumed that doors opened conventionally, and most fire departments didn't carry tools capable of cutting through the 300 SL's space frame construction. By the time rescue teams figured out how to access trapped occupants, it was often too late. The combination of exotic construction and unfamiliar door systems created deadly delays in rescue operations. The psychological impact on surviving family members was devastating. Knowing that their loved ones had survived the initial impact but died because they couldn't escape added an extra layer of tragedy to these accidents. Some crashes were relatively minor, with occupants conscious and uninjured immediately after impact, only to perish when doors wouldn't open and fires consumed the car. Mercedes eventually added small sliding windows to later models, but these were too small for most adults to crawl through. The company also developed emergency door release mechanisms, but these were complicated procedures that required specific knowledge and weren't intuitive in panic situations. Most owners never learned how to use the emergency releases, making them useless when accidents actually occurred. The irony was that the 300 SL was marketed as the ultimate in automotive sophistication and safety. Mercedes emphasized its advanced engineering and racing pedigree, but they downplayed the inherent dangers of the Gullwing design. Wealthy buyers assumed they were purchasing the safest car money could buy, when in fact they were getting a beautiful death trap with no escape route. It's a perfect example of form over function. Sometimes, what looks iconic is actually deadly. Want a Japanese entry? Because there's one car that surprised everyone with how dangerous it became. The Suzuki Samurai. Cheap, fun, tiny off-roader. Also known for flipping like a coin, it had a ridiculously narrow track and a high center of gravity, which made it insanely easy to roll over. Consumer Reports even slammed it in the 1980s, showing how easily it could tip, which Suzuki, of course, denied. But drivers knew the truth. The Suzuki Samurai's rollover problems weren't immediately obvious because they seemed like such innocent little trucks. They were narrow, lightweight, and underpowered, more like motorized golf carts than serious off-road vehicles. But those innocent characteristics created a perfect storm of instability that caught thousands of drivers completely off guard. The fundamental problem was geometry. The Samurai was essentially a tall box sitting on a narrow wheelbase. At 62 inches tall but only 55 inches wide, it had proportions that defied basic physics. The center of gravity was absurdly high, and the track width was so narrow that any significant sideways force could overcome the car's stability. It wasn't a question of if it would roll over, but when and how violently. Consumer Reports' testing methodology was particularly damning. They performed standard emergency lane change maneuvers that any driver might encounter avoiding a deer or merging into traffic. At speeds as low as 35 miles per hour, the Samurai would lift its inside wheels completely off the ground, balanced on the edge of rolling over. More aggressive maneuvers would send it tumbling end over end with frightening ease. No other vehicle in Consumer Reports' history had performed so poorly in stability testing. Suzuki's response to the criticism was corporate denial taken to absurd lengths. Company executives claimed that Consumer Reports had deliberately sabotaged their testing, that real-world conditions were different from test conditions, and that driver error was responsible for rollover accidents. They threatened lawsuits and launched an expensive public relations campaign to discredit the safety concerns. Meanwhile, emergency rooms across America were treating Samurai rollover victims at an alarming rate. The rollover accidents followed predictable patterns. Most occurred during routine driving maneuvers that would be completely safe in normal vehicles. Swerving to avoid road debris, taking highway off-ramps slightly too fast, or making emergency stops on uneven surfaces all could trigger violent rollovers. Because the Samurai was so light, it would often flip multiple times, tumbling across lanes of traffic and injuring occupants and bystanders alike. The soft convertible top made rollovers particularly deadly. Unlike hardtop vehicles with substantial roll cages, the Samurai's fabric roof provided virtually no protection when the car flipped. Occupants would be crushed by the vehicle's own weight, or thrown from the tumbling car onto asphalt or concrete. The side impact protection was minimal, consisting mainly of thin door frames that would collapse immediately upon impact. Weather conditions amplified the danger. In crosswinds, the Samurai's tall, narrow profile made it act like a sail, with gusts of wind capable of pushing it off the road or triggering rollovers. Rain and snow made the situation worse by reducing tire traction just enough to trigger the type-over sequence. Many accidents involved drivers who were simply trying to maintain control in normal weather conditions. Turn too sharply? Roll. Dodge a deer? Roll. Take an off-ramp too fast? Roll. It didn't matter if you were a careful driver, this thing was a tumbleweed. And while we're talking about weird death traps, the Yugo GV, a cheap communist-era hatchback sold in the US in the 80s. And maybe one of the most unsafe cars ever made. No airbags, no crumple zones, terrible brakes. It was like driving a beer can. In crashes, it folded like paper, and worse, it had awful build quality. Engines failed, doors jammed, and parts fell off. The Yugo represented everything wrong with communist-era manufacturing applied to American roads. Built in Yugoslavia by workers who had no understanding of American driving conditions or safety standards, these cars were essentially death traps disguised as transportation. The metal was thin, the welds were poor, and the overall construction quality was so bad that cars would literally fall apart during normal use. Crash protection was non-existent by any reasonable standard. The Yugo's body was constructed from steel so thin that it would crumple catastrophically in even minor accidents. There were no crumple zones to absorb impact energy, no reinforced passenger cells to protect occupants, and no side impact protection of any kind. The doors were held on by hinges so weak that they would often pop open during accidents, ejecting occupants onto the roadway. The brake system was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Yugo ownership. The brakes were undersized for the car's weight and completely inadequate for American highway speeds. Brake fade occurred regularly during normal driving, and complete brake failure was common enough that experienced Yugo drivers learned to anticipate it. The brake pedal would often go to the floor with no warning, leaving drivers with no way to stop except by turning off the engine and hoping for the best. Engine fires were another constant danger. The Yugo's electrical system was so poorly designed that short circuits were routine occurrences. Wiring would overheat, insulation would melt, and fires would start in the engine bay without warning. The fuel system was equally dangerous, with fuel lines that would crack and leak gasoline onto hot engine components. Many Yugos burned to the ground in parking lots, with no accident or external cause required. The heating and ventilation systems posed their own deadly hazards. Like the Corvair, Yugos could leak carbon monoxide into the passenger compartment through poorly sealed heating systems. The exhaust manifolds would crack, allowing toxic gases to enter the cabin air supply. Some owners were found unconscious in their cars, poisoned by their own vehicle's emissions. Quality control was so bad that basic safety equipment often didn't work. Seatbelts would fail to latch or would come undone during accidents. Door locks would jam, trapping occupants in burning or sinking vehicles. Even the steering wheel could come off in drivers' hands, a failure so basic that it seemed impossible until it happened to you. The legendary story of a Yugo being blown off a bridge by wind wasn't just folklore, it actually happened. The car's lightweight and poor aerodynamics made it vulnerable to crosswinds that wouldn't affect normal vehicles. The Mackinac Bridge incident, where a Yugo was literally lifted off the roadway by a gust of wind and deposited in the water below, became symbolic of the car's fundamental inadequacy. Even basic maintenance was dangerous. The jack provided with the car was so flimsy that it would collapse without warning, crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be underneath. The spare tire was often defective or completely flat, leaving drivers stranded with no safe way to change a tire. Parts would literally fall off while driving, with owners discovering missing components only when other drivers honked and pointed at debris trailing behind their cars. Even basic safety features didn't work half the time. One driver was literally blown off a bridge by a gust of wind. Not even kidding. It was cheap and it showed. Let's get a bit more modern. The Chevy Cobalt. Looks harmless, right? But in the mid-2000s, the Cobalt had a hidden slayer: faulty ignition switches. The switches could slip into off while driving, shutting down the engine. And here's the terrifying part: disabling the airbags. Drivers would crash and the airbags wouldn't deploy. Over 120 deaths were linked to this defect, and GM didn't act fast enough. The Chevrolet Cobalt ignition switch scandal represented corporate negligence at its most callous. This wasn't a complex engineering failure or an unforeseeable design flaw. It was a simple mechanical switch that GM knew was defective, and yet they allowed millions of these cars to remain on the road with a known deadly defect for over a decade. The ignition switch itself was a marvel of poor engineering. The detent spring that held the switch in the run position was too weak to handle the weight of a normal keyring. Add a few keys, some keychains, and the natural vibration of driving, and the switch would gradually work its way from run to accessory or off. When this happened, the engine would shut down immediately, power steering and brakes would be lost, and most critically, the airbag system would be disabled. The timing of these failures was particularly deadly. The switches were most likely to fail during spirited driving, when engine vibration was highest and steering inputs were most frequent. This meant that drivers would lose power and airbag protection just when they needed them most, during emergency maneuvers or high-stress driving situations. Many accidents involved drivers who were attempting to avoid collisions when their cars suddenly lost power and became uncontrollable. GM's internal timeline showed a pattern of willful negligence that bordered on criminal. Engineers first identified the ignition switch problems in 2004, shortly after the Cobalt entered production. Internal emails discussed the safety implications and potential legal liability, but management decided that issuing a recall would be too expensive and would damage the brand's reputation. They chose to quietly redesign the switch for future production while leaving existing customers with the defective parts. The cover-up was systematic and thorough. GM instructed dealership service technicians not to use the term ignition switch in service reports, instead using euphemisms like key position or starting issues. This semantic manipulation was designed to prevent pattern recognition that might trigger regulatory attention or class action lawsuits. When customers complained about their cars shutting off while driving, dealers were instructed to blame heavy keychains or driver error. The human cost was staggering and preventable. Young drivers were disproportionately affected because they were more likely to have heavy keychains and to drive aggressively enough to trigger the switch failures. Many victims were teenagers or young adults who had chosen the Cobalt as their first new car, trusting GM's reputation for safety and reliability. Their families later learned that GM had known about the deadly defect for years before their children died. The airbag connection made accidents particularly tragic. In many cases, victims survived the initial loss of power and even managed to avoid serious collisions through skilled driving. But when secondary impacts occurred, the disabled airbags left them completely unprotected. People who might have survived with minor injuries in a properly functioning car instead suffered fatal trauma because their safety systems had been disabled by a 57-cent part. Congressional hearings revealed the full scope of GM's negligence. Company executives admitted that they had chosen not to recall the vehicles because they feared bankruptcy proceedings might be complicated by additional legal liability. They literally decided that protecting corporate finances was more important than protecting customer lives. The moral bankruptcy was as complete as the financial bankruptcy that eventually followed. It took years and multiple lawsuits before the full recall happened. A small mechanical part that led to major loss of life. Now for the one you were teased about earlier, the worst of the worst, the Dodge Viper. Let's be clear, this car is an icon and a weapon. Early Vipers had no ABS, no traction control, no stability systems, and yet they packed over 400 horsepower into a lightweight body. You had to fight this car to keep it under control, and if you lost focus for even a second, the Viper would bite back, fast. The original Dodge Viper was conceived as a modern interpretation of the 1960s Shelby Cobra, a car that had already established a reputation for killing inexperienced drivers. Chrysler's engineers succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in recreating that deadly combination of massive power and minimal electronic intervention. The result was a car that demanded complete respect and perfect technique from every driver every single time they turned the key. The Viper's V10 engine was essentially a truck motor modified for sports car duty. It produced massive torque across a wide rev range, delivering power with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The throttle response was immediate and brutal, with no electronic filtering to smooth out driver inputs. A slight mistake with the accelerator pedal could send the rear wheels into violent wheel spin, snapping the car sideways faster than most drivers could react. Without traction control or stability management, the Viper would punish the smallest errors with devastating consequences. Professional race car drivers described the early Viper as one of the most challenging cars they had ever driven. If professionals struggled with it, weekend warriors had no chance. The car would bite without warning, going from controllable to airborne in milliseconds. The insurance industry quickly learned to fear Viper owners. Premiums were astronomical, often exceeding the cost of more expensive supercars because the accident rate was so high. Many insurance companies simply refused to write policies for Vipers, while others required extensive track training and experience verification before providing coverage. Even then, deductibles were often set so high that minor accidents would cost owners tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket. The psychological factor was crucial in understanding why the Viper was so deadly. The car made drivers feel invincible, with its aggressive styling and incredible performance creating a false sense of control. Many owners pushed these cars beyond their abilities on public roads, treating highways like racetracks. The car's theatrical presence seemed to encourage showing off, often with tragic results. Emergency responders developed special protocols for Viper accidents because they were often so severe. The car's low seating position and minimal crash protection meant that even moderate speed impacts could be fatal. The fiberglass body provided little protection in side impacts, and the lack of modern safety systems meant that occupants were entirely dependent on the car's basic structure for protection. Track day events became notorious for Viper crashes. Weekend enthusiasts would arrive at racing circuits with minimal training, convinced that their expensive car would compensate for their lack of skill. The results were predictable and tragic. Many track day organizations eventually banned Vipers or required extensive safety equipment and driver training before allowing them to participate. So many people crashed them that insurance premiums were insane. Worse still, many buyers were weekend warriors, not pro drivers. The result? Hundreds of fatalities, many during street races or backroad blasts. The Viper didn't just punish mistakes. It ended them, but there were many US car brands that too had to end. I made a full video on American car brands that have completely disappeared, and you can watch that now by clicking the video on screen. See you in the next one.